Okay, hi. So if you're a fan of Tintin and his comics, then you're simply going to love this book. It's called Tintin, Hergé and His Creation, and it's by a writer called Harry Thompson, and he's got a P in his name. So that's kind of important to understand. If you're a Tintin fan, you'll get that reference. And this book is really very good because it traces the historical evolution of both Tintin the character and the writer. Auger. Auger, by the way, was arrived upon by the writer's real name was Georges Remy, and the real name was arrived at the his pen name was arrived at by interchanging his initials. So Georges Remy became becomes GR, became RG, which is in French is Auger, and that's how his name came about. By the way, so that's an interesting tip. But generally, the book is really nice because it takes you across. It talks about every Tintin book in the entire series, and he takes you across the story of each one being made and produced. And it starts with Tintin starting as a comic strip in one of the periodicals back in Belgium or France. And essentially, the first two books were quite a little bit underwhelming if you read them now. They were not published as books initially, obviously, they were cartoon strips, but they became really popular. However, they were a little bit, if you read them now, they're a little bit distressing as a Tintin fan, honestly, because politically quite incorrect and not really compassionate. So Tintin in the Land of the Soviets is quite an immature book. And also, if you look at Tintin in Congo, then it's quite disrespectful of the wildlife and all that. But essentially, from there, Tintin goes on to become this really huge body of work that has a massive cultural impact across the world and is accepted in multiple parts of the world by young readers and adults alike, because it has such a huge impact, because it appeals to the boy within us. These are glorious adventures all over the world, exploring different cultures, looking at different parts of the world. It's almost like having an adventure while you're sitting there. Also, the writer points out very rightly so, I think, is that it's a very sophisticated character comedy as it goes along, particularly as the evolution of the books happen. The books start getting better and better. Auger, as he grew up and matured, both from an artistic perspective and also a geopolitical understanding perspective, the books got much better. And Auger has been accused of being many things. So particularly with his first two books, he's accused of being racist, he's accused of being anti-Semitic because of the portrayal of some characters in some of his early books. And then he's also accused of being a Nazi collaborator, because during the Second World War he continued to work for the newspaper that the Nazis controlled when they occupied Belgium. And the writer does point out that if you look at his later work, some of his later work, even during the time that he was writing, during the Second World War and soon after, or even before that, actually, soon after, of course, once the Nazis is lost, it was kind of pointless. But even before that, the books he was working on were subversive in terms of their plots and some of the characters in against the Nazis. So that's pointed out. And also the fact that Auger had, Tintin, if you look at as a character, Tintin essentially stands up for the oppressed, right? He talks to, he kind of stands up for, like basically the underdog, and stands up for political rights and all of those kinds of things. So he's shown as a politically liberal. And Auger kind of redeems himself. Maybe he was a victim of the thinking at the time in the 30s when he was starting to write. Those were interesting times. Political right wing was gaining traction. He was influenced by the thought of the time at some point as a very young boy when he started making Tintin. And characters like Mussolini and Hitler were emerging on the scene, and there were lots of fans across Europe, actually. And so it would kind of be natural to for Auger to reflect that, because he didn't have the benefit of knowing better at the time. But as he discovered more, the writer points out that he, for example, dispels the notions of what people think about the Chinese, for example, right? So if you look at the Blue Lotus, he talks about those misconceptions that Western people have about the Chinese and so on and so forth. And he and Chang have a bit of a laugh about it. So at some level, the writer tried to redeem himself or redeemed himself, depending on your perspective. Then talking of Chang, the book also mentions how Chang is actually based on a real character that helped Tintin understand and research his subject a little bit more. And I think that kind of is where Tintin eventually went, because if you look at the later books, the drawing started getting much more detailed. the stories started getting much more aware of geopolitical situations. They were based around sometimes real events, and then later on, not based on actual events, but inspired by the world around us and the current affairs around us and stuff like that. So they were always adventures and set in a different part of the world, inspired by real events or sometimes actually based on real events. So, for example, the Japanese occupation of China and so on and so forth. So basically, it traces the entire evolution, talks about each individual book, and sometimes those stories are fantastic because if you look at, how Red Rackham's treasure came about, and how some of the drawings were so detailed, and how they were based on actual ships from the period and so on and so forth, and how those drawings got really intricate. Hergé, by the way, artistically also grew, and he was known to be the person that invented the ligne claire, as it's called in French, which means the clear line style of comic books, which influenced a generation more of comic book writers and illustrators. So he had a profound impact, particularly on the French scene and the European scene of comic books, and a lot of people kind of were inspired by him. Also, just as a body of work, Tintin has inspired a whole bunch of creators, creative people, such as Steven Spielberg, just being one example, who even made a movie about the Tintin series, based on the Tintin series. But it's just a body of work that has had a huge cultural impact, translated into so many multiple languages and stuff like that. But it's a lot of my friends actually compare Tintin to Asterix. When I talk about Tintin, they say I love Asterix, and it's better as a comic book and stuff like that, because I think they had the same format in the same kind of big format book, and they were both of them were very well illustrated. But I think that's where the comparison stops. I think this is a personal opinion that that the Tintin books were far superior artistically because they had a bigger aspiration. They wanted to tell stories that were deeper, slightly more meaningful. The character comedy was much better. It was based on real things happening around us. So, for example, if you look at, but that's all fine because Asterix also has some very clever references, although it's set in that period in Gaul when the Romans and Julius Caesar were ruling. But it has some clever references and talks about the world, all of that stuff, and it's very pithy. But these works seem very personal, and they kind of try and explore some kind of spirituality as well. So, for example, Tintin in Tibet, right, is a deeply personal work, and it's quite moving in certain phases, especially because it deals with a fairly serious subject about his friend, Tintin's friend Chang, being given up for dead, and then his just his persistence in kind of and his faith in believing that Chang will be alive, and kind of giving up almost everything to go hunt for him is very kind of a serious theme. And also it seems like Hergé, the artist, was a fairly tortured soul towards the end because he had a very difficult relationship with Tintin, having worked with him all his life and having developed some of the other characters. It started more and more reflecting his real life. So the book kind of draws parallels to Hergé and not Tintin, strangely, but Captain Haddock, and he kind of makes fun of himself at that level, being irritated by insurance salesmen like Jolyon Wag and stuff like that. And the irritants in his life almost seem to reflect the kind of irritants in Hergé's life. So Captain Haddock actually kind of became his alter ego, also the closest friend to Tintin and stuff like that. So there's very interesting stuff there in the books for fans, particularly. And if you read the book as a fan, it's an absolute must because you'll get to know your character so much better. I've been a Tintin fan. I've read the comic books 25, 30 times. I still enjoy them once in a while. And that's actually the beauty of Tintin is that they're read and reread and passed on from generation to generation. And they're still relevant, like a Sherlock Holmes or certain timeless characters that may be set in a certain period but remain relevant and universal for a really long period of time or across centuries. And Tintin's a bit like that because it's based in a certain period, but it still remains universal. The other thing is with Tintin is that if you look at, I was talking about the journey of the artist, and towards the end, Hergé had such a difficult relationship with Tintin that whenever he tried to draw him, basically he would get eczema on his hands and not be able to draw, and he'd have to stop for a long period. There's also the whole process of how it got commercialized because the person who rescued him ultimately from being arrested and for being a Nazi collaborator was essentially a resistance hero in Belgium who happened to be a huge Tintin fan, but then he took the rights to make Tintin. And for example, the Tintin and the Lake of Sharks was not Hergé's work really. It was based on the characters created by Hergé, but it wasn't the same level of artistic achievement because somebody else made it in that license, under that arrangement, commercial arrangement. But anyway, so Hergé, towards the end, like I said, had a difficult, the writer talks about how he had a difficult relationship, but then he kind of reconciled himself. And it's one of the great, it's one of the great regrets of many of his fans, or, the fact that he wasn't able to actually produce, do prolific work towards the end. I think he took 7 years for the penultimate Tintin book, and the ultimate one that he was working on that he never completed, it took 10 years or something, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so that's, fans were left wanting more. And there's one last incomplete book called Tintin and Alphard, which is the last work that Hergé was working on before he passed away. So this book, really great for fans, treasure trove of information, and you'll go through it. If you're a Tintin fan, you'll just kind of run through it. But even if you're not a fan, it's really interesting because it talks about a body of work that's had a huge cultural impact. And also, it's set in some a really interesting period in the 30s during the Second World War and soon after, and talks about some very interesting works. For example, Destination Moon and Explorers on the Moon was written about 10 years before the actual moon landing happened. So the research and some of the anticipation and some of the verisimilitude in the books was really fantastic. And considering that it was essentially a comic book, it was really interesting to see all of that. So I really enjoyed reading this book and kind of living my Tintin adventures all over again, discovering more about them, discovering more about the writer. And if you check it out, tell me what you think and put it in the comments, and hopefully we can discuss it at some point. Anyway, toodaloo.